Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Sunday, I hope. Welcome to session 6, and we're going to go over variables and standardized instruments today. And then I believe there'll be plenty of time for breakout groups for you to advance your projects and go further. Before we get going, any questions or comments or thoughts before we start up? Well, feel free to unmute and ask anything along the way. So you'll remember that in our last session, we talked about theory example, uh, variable types table, and as we go into the breakout session, if you have your table prepared, I'd be glad to review it and give you some critique on it before you finalize and submit it, if your team would like. Also talked about assembling the research question with some examples for assignment 2. And we talked about the difference between conceptual and operational definitions, which also fed into your table, and of course, external and internal validity concepts. Regarding the literature review, if your team is in the process of embarking on literature review, I'll remind you that those very rapidly paced videos are still there and available for you on Canvas. You're welcome to download and review those as many times as you want. They're yours for the taking, so feel free to access those again. Let's talk about some standardized measurement instruments. The notion of standardized measurement instruments is when we're measuring, we want measurement instruments that are standardized, and this provides for rigorous research procedures aimed at, as empirically as possible, verifying the characteristics and results and applicability. And what I mean by empirical is before the thought of science and empiricism, so much of the world was being explained by unseen forces, the evil eye and superstition and so forth. And then there was a move toward scientific method, which is empiricism. And the idea there is, spirits invading people and making them sick. Let's push that aside. And from here forward, we're only going to measure things that can actually be measured, not just belief systems and superstitions and so forth. And this led to an entirely different method of doing science. Is if we can't see it and measure it, we're not going to focus on it. And this is what we mean by empirical data. You've probably heard empirical science before. That's what we're talking about. Sometimes it's called the positivistic approach to science. And so with that, let's think about some of the most common devices that we have that provide unified, usable metrics. For instance, if we want to know the length of something, we pull out a ruler, and we all live in agreement of how long is an inch. And when you have 12 of them, that's called a foot. And the inch can be divided into segments. You can have a half inch, quarter inch, 3/8 inch, whatever. But the main thing is we all agree on how long an inch is. And so when we communicate with each other and we say, that's an inch and a half thick stack of paper, or that's a 4-inch tall slice of cake, we're all talking about the same thing, and we accept the same thing. And your ruler isn't scaled different from my ruler. So we're using a unified metric so we can communicate effectively with each other on length. But a ruler is not the only device. If you want to measure how heavy something is, a ruler is not your good choice. If you want to measure body weight, you need to step on, say, a standard scale. And on that scale, weights and measures, we have agreed how much does a pound weigh? And we all understand how much a pound is, and we all agree on it. And we create devices that'll measure pounds in a reliable and consistent manner. Further, if we want to measure time, the ruler isn't going to be the job, and neither is the scale. We need something like a stopwatch or maybe a calendar if we're looking at longer periods of time. And to that point, we all agree we know how long a second is, and we're all in agreement with that. We know how long a minute is. It's 60 of those seconds, and a second is that long. So with these unified metrics, we can gather much more precise data and we can communicate more effectively with each other. Can anyone think of any other devices that we might use to measure things that we all agree on the scaling and the metric of it?
A clock.
What's that?
Distance.
Distance, absolutely. So whether it's kilometers or miles, we know how long a kilometer is. We know how long a mile is. So we're going beyond what the ruler will take us to. Sometimes we need to scale up to a different device, like an odometer or something else. But we all agree that that's the right way to go and what the unit of measure is going to be. How about any other measurement instrument to measure another phenomenon?
I also said a
Decibels.
clock.
What, say again?
I said a clock to measure time.
A clock. Yeah, absolutely. We don't walk around with a stopwatch. That's when we're measuring minutes and seconds, and we want that to end. But yeah, we got clocks. Here's one right here. How about another example? Let's pick up one more. I heard another voice.
Decibels.
Decibels. Isn't that a good one? So we all agree that with this many decibels, this is how loud or soft the sound is, right? And we could have a thermometer and different types of thermometer, one to pick up the temperature outside, one that you can stick in your mouth or scan your forehead or your ear with. So, right, but the main thing is we want real numbers that we can code and follow those numbers and communicate effectively with other people on this. So good thinking there. So I think we've kind of already answered some of this. Is what are some of the advantages of using standardized instruments within research studies? Can somebody put that together?
It's agreed upon, like it's not necessarily debatable when you're using standardized instruments. It's like objective.
Exactly. So, for instance, let's step into. We'll go from positivistic, where it's concrete measurements like inches or time that we all agree to, but sometimes we have to take a leap, something that's not directly measurable, like say mood. How are we going to quantify something like that? And to that, and we'll get there, there are developed instruments, and so that we all wind up measuring mood the same way. So that I don't have one estimate of what the person's mood is, and somebody else has a completely other conceptualization of what the person's mood is. And this, so if we have these good metrics that are steady and solid, how can this help a research project? What does this do for us as scientists?
Well, for example, with what we're doing with the code book is because most of the stuff is in a numerical Likert type scale for each of the questions. We're able to all agree saying, well, all the students, or three-quarters of the students said they ranked something at a 4 compared to a 1 or a 5. So we can all agree that they're at this point or right in that area.
Right. So we are all speaking the same language of the unified metric, and it enables some quantitative analysis. We can run the numbers on these, and we can make comparisons within groups, across groups, see where they're landing on the Likert scale. We can actually do some numerical analysis to more deeply understand what's going on. Did this group significantly outperform that group, or are they both about the same, or is it the opposite? Now we can come to understand what are relationships like. And without nailed down numbers, that becomes almost impossible. So, among the advantages, we have uniform administration. And I think we've pretty much touched on a lot of these also, meaning I'm not going to be gathering the mood score one way, and then somebody else on the team is gathering the mood score another way. You know, I might be gathering the mood score on a 1 to 10 scale, and somebody else might say, no, I don't think they're depressed. There's no depression here. And they're just going yes or no. But there's no way to really bring those numbers together. So the uniform administration and uniform scoring, we're going to run these numbers exactly the same way and analyze them the same way. And this can generalize some some normative data, meaning what's going on among the student population. We can start to answer a question like that. What seems to be the trend? What's the normal level of functioning going on here? And if we have all of these unified, we can get better, stronger answers along those lines. So to get a little bit more specifics, uniform administration and scoring. Every person to whom a particular standardized measurement instrument is administered should be treated in exactly the same way. So for instance, if this is a paper and pencil survey and it's self-administered, I don't come by to some people and say, you might want to spend a little bit extra time on question 11. That's, we're really hopeful that students are happy with office hours, which is asked about at question 11. And now I'm biasing this terribly. If this is meant to be self-administered, we hand it out and we walk away. Or we send them the web link and they can do this at their own convenience. So going on further, in theory, the only reason individuals should be scored differently on an instrument is that they differ on the variable that's being measured, meaning I just want the purity of their response. I don't want any bias or anything funny happening that I'm treating these people different from those people. More specifically, suppose we're talking about the student survey that you're going to analyze. It would be a bit of an anomaly that would be something that I'd be curious about if some of them took it on pencil and paper in a classroom and others took it privately on a website or an app, or if some took it and had to put their name on it, but others were administered anonymously. All of those things could have an effect on the dependent variable, the variable that we're measuring, or the multiple variables that we're measuring. So we want things as unified as possible. And when we get into rapid assessment instruments, one of the rules of the road is if you're going to use a prepared instrument, you're not supposed to change the formatting. You're not supposed to translate it to another language. You're not even supposed to change the layout. It's been validated as is, and this is not a time to start making changes to it. It's pretty strict rules, and this is about uniformity. Okay. So measurement conditions and outcomes are clearly specified to ensure comparability across respondents and across research situations. So if it's a two-site study, I'm not going to, at one site, read the questions out loud one by one and have people respond, and then another one, I walk out of the room and it's self-administered. It needs to be done the same way. Even that could affect the outcomes of some. And of course, detailed instructions about how the instrument is to be administered, to whom it is administered, and the exact meaning and the results of the results need to be specified in an implementation guide so that there's no guesswork. Well, is this something I need to read to them? Is this self-administered? Is this anonymous? Is it confidential? All of these things could affect the way the responses come through. I'll share an experience that I had in my master's program. Some doctoral students came into the room about the last 15 minutes of class and said, "Hi, we're here to administer this student survey, and your participation is appreciated." And I saw that there was no name on the instrument, and so I thought, okay, well, this is good. And they had a box that you could just drop it into at the front of the class, and then you can leave. And they were a little bit less than professional and refined scientists at the time. So the first student finished and got up and dropped their paper into the open Dropbox and walked out of the room. And the first thing the researchers did was reach in and start reviewing it and looking it over. And I thought, this isn't anonymous. That's not funny. That should have been a sealed box with a slit in the top, and you can look at them after the whole class is over. And so I wouldn't fill it out. I just opted out. And if I would have filled it out, I probably, I don't want any news to leak back to my instructor or anything. I would have put in a bunch of false nonsense that just shows how idyllically happy I am in this program. I didn't want anything to pollute my reputation there. And so that very act of them changed the implementation. That was just, that changed what I was going to do, something as simple as that. Okay. So when we're talking about generating normative data, we're talking about group standards. We're trying to understand what is normal for this group. So norms are group standards usually based on the group's average or their mean score on the measurement instrument. So if we find out that average number of hours that part-time students spend on academic work is 16 hours a week, that average informs us. It's like, this is the characteristic of the group. This is what's going on with them. And we didn't know that before we calculated the average or the mean. So it can set group standards. We can also get an idea of what is typical performance within this group. So by giving information on the typical performance of a group, we can understand the norms and provide a point of comparison, a reference point that we can use to interpret individual scores. So once again, suppose we find out that for part-time students, on average, and let's say it's a relatively small standard deviation, that students are spending about 16 hours a week outside of class doing coursework. And then we find another student who's struggling, their grades are weak, and we ask them, so about how many hours a week do you spend doing your coursework? And this, an hour, two maybe, I skim read the stuff. Now we have a new talking point. We can say, your peers who, not to criticize you, but who are showing a stronger academic performance, they're putting in about 16 hours a week. And so we can use this to better understand what is going on with any one individual compared to what's the story on their peers. Larger samples, suffices to say, if you've ever had a statistics course, probably the one big lesson you walked away with is, in terms of sample size, bigger is better. And this gets to the notion of statistical power, which maybe you've run across in some publications that talk about what statistical power is. And that's answering the question, do you have a sufficient sample size to make the kinds of determinations that you have with any reliability or any real solidity? And so this would be something like, could I get a volunteer? It's just, you're going to answer a yes/no question. You could say yes or no. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. Just any volunteer, please.
Cool.
Okay, so volunteer. Survey question. Vote by mail, yay or nay?
Yay.
Okay, and then I could come out and publish that according to a recent university poll, 100% of those surveyed indicated that they were for vote by mail. Well, and then I publish my sample size, and it's all of 1. And if I were to compute the power on that, it would show as being, I'm not going to get into power calculations, but it's profoundly underpowered. And so now, as I have larger sample size, a sample of 22,000 university students indicates, okay, now I don't even need to see the sample power. I get it. So bigger is better in terms of sample. There is a limit, though, that you don't have to go on forever with gathering your sample. You don't have to sample the whole population. And that's the elegance of sampling the power calculations, is it tells you where you should stop based on the statistic that you're running. And then, of course, we have descriptive statistics. And this gives us the chance to run some computations, get some real numbers. We don't have to make up anything that says, oh, yeah, this group is doing kind of good, or compared to this group that's doing like much better is we can get the numbers to tell an empirical story for us and solidify what our claims are. What is it we're saying? Well, here it is in the numbers too. It also gives you the power to run inferential statistics, so we can do more than just talk about the average performance of this group, especially when we're comparing it to some other group. We can say that part-timers are studying this long, full-timers are studying that long, and we can get the statistics to tell us if there's a significant difference between those. Or we could stratify it another way. We could say we see that part-time females are studying this long, part-time males are studying this long, and we can then tell if there is a significant difference in their study hours or if everyone's studying about the same hours. So descriptive statistics gets us beyond subjective opinion, and we can really nail down what our observations are catching. We can also, through our metrics, go from a raw score to a derived score. And this is a concept that you're already familiar with. You've already been in this, where the raw score is the actual number that's rendered by the individual. And then it gets translated into some kind of a derived score based on group norms or standards. And the easiest example of this is if in a class your performance was 96%, this gets translated to a derived score of an A. So the 96 is the raw score. Those are the total number of points that you accumulated over the course. And then that gets translated based on the table. The 90 to 100 is A, 80 to 89 is the B, and so on down the line. And this enables us to create categories of performances. So we can know what proportion of the population earns an A. And the A has a label to it also. That's excellent. B, better than average. C, average, and so on. So we go from raw score to derived score to attach some more meaning to it, more specific meaning. Because there's not much difference really between someone who scores 96 and 96.1. And so this is a way of clustering categories, groups of numbers, of raw scores into something that's more meaningful to us. So again, translating the raw score of 96 into the derived score helps us answer the question, what is the student's academic performance? Translate that into that number into something that I can understand in the real world. So any questions on the leap from raw score to a derived score? Okay, fairly straightforward. So let's take a look at one of these standardized instruments. I selected the Beck Depression Inventory as an exemplar because depression is just such a common diagnosis among our clients that we see. I believe it's among the most prevalent disorders. And here we have the Beck Depression Inventory. So just going back to empirical measures, we have things like thermometer that you can put in someone's mouth or scan their forehead, and it'll produce a number, tell you how many degrees of heat they have. And somebody mentioned decibel. We have sound sensors that can tell you exactly how loud something is and capture and report back the decibels. And we know these things. We can use a ruler to measure the length of how big is this mouse pad. Get your ruler out and count the inches. This is what would be called empirical or positivistic. But sometimes we have to make the leap to something that is not so readily measurable, that we don't have a physical instrument, that we can take a ruler and measure someone's depression, and we can't take a decibel meter and figure out by how loud the person is how depressed they are. And this is where we make the leap from positivist, empiricist, to post-positivist, where we have a phenomenon that can't be directly measured, but we don't throw our arms up and say, well, we can't quantify it. We make a leap, and we'll create an instrument like the Beck Depression Inventory that if they answer these questions, it's going to provide a number that we would normally pull off of a thermometer or a ruler And that number is going to represent this abstraction, this sense of depression that we cannot measure directly. And in the medical realm, also, when the nurse comes in to take your vital signs, what? She counts your respirations to get breaths per minute. There's your respiration. We'll count your pulse. We'll take your blood pressure, which renders two other numbers, systolic and diastolic. But we don't yet have an instrument that captures the pains, how much pain someone is in. And so have you ever seen the chart that they hold up that shows 1 to 10, and 1 is kind of a smiling face and 10 is like kind of an unhappy crying face? And they'll ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being comfortable and 10 being the worst pain you could feel, about where would you say your pain is now? Because we don't have an instrument that you can hook up to someone and get their pain level. You have to ask them. And so this takes the leap from empiricist to post-empiricist. We have to operationalize that and get that answer out of someone. So this is the Beck Depression Inventory. And I'm going to show you how it works and how simple it works and how typical it is of other standardized instruments that we have for social work, the mental health field. And as you see, it's a set of questions. And let's just look at question 1. So you'd answer this the best you can. Just circle one number. 0, I do not feel sad. 1, I feel sad. 2, I am sad all the time and I can't snap out of it. 3, I am sad and unhappy. I am so sad and unhappy that I can't stand it. So what do you see as we move from 0 to 3 in terms of depression? What's your observation there, just on this first question?
It's a scale.
It's a scale. And what else about that scale? You're
Also,
right, absolutely. But what about that scale?
it's based on time. Sorry about that.
It's what?
I was gonna say it's based on time. The scale is based on.
It's based. I'm not seeing that it's really based on time. But what is the common thread through those 4 choices?
It usually gets progressively worse. Like from 0, it's like, I don't feel sad. And then by 3, then it's like, I hate myself.
That's exactly it. It's getting progressively worse. So it's not so much about time, it's about the intensity of the phenomenon. And it goes in its progressive direction. It goes from I do not feel sad all the way up to I am so sad and unhappy that I can't stand it. It gets easy, and then it gets heavier, heavier, and heavier. And so the number is increasing as the severity is increasing. So we kind of get a clue of how this instrument operates. Let's take a look at the second question and see if it follows the same trend. 0, I am not particularly discouraged about the future. So there's some optimism there. 1, I feel discouraged about the future. 2, I have nothing to look forward to. Okay, it's getting kind of dark. And then 3, I feel the future is hopeless and that things cannot improve. Now that's completely hopeless. And so once again, we see it starts at 0 and it gets worse and worse and worse. So we can see that the bigger the number, the heavier the phenomenon. And that's true throughout the thing. Now, occasionally, this will be flipped. And that's to detect if they're just going through and circling numbers. And we're looking for inconsistency there. So sometimes it'll tell you to reverse score selected questions. So we hand this out, and this is built to be a self-administered survey. And the person will just go through and circle the numbers. And then they'll go on to the second page. And it's more questions. It ends with 21 questions, and they'll circle their numbers there, and then they'll hand it back to us. And this could be on paper. It could be an app. A lot of these are computerized because, well, computers are just good at doing simple surveys and calculating numbers and handing us the number at the end. And then at the end, the last page, which typically we don't hand this page out to the person taking it. We have this page, and it gives us scoring instructions. And if you read through the scoring instructions, you'll see that it's just telling you just add up all the scores from all the questions. And this renders 14. And then here's our total score, where we go from the raw score to the translated score. And so they're 14, and it says, okay, 11 to 16. That translates to a mild mood disturbance, as opposed to something like extreme depression or severe depression, or however this has been broken down. So you can see here that we made the leap from the raw score of 14. I was like, well, what does 14 mean in depression world? And here we have the translated scores. Like, okay, now I understand where they are, and it makes sense. So this is a real life example of making the leap from the raw score to the translated score, so that we can more deeply understand. Now, if somebody handed this in to me, yes, I would be very interested in their total score. And by the way, you see, these instruments are that easy to take, and I'll show you some examples of some other instruments, but they're that easy to take, and they're that easy to score. In fact, you don't need a computer to score these. The calculator on your cell phone is sufficient. Seriously, about all you do on these is add up scores. They're designed so that you don't have to remember all of your statistics to be able to do these. This could be a very useful instrument if somebody comes in with depression on their first appointment. Maybe you'll have them fill one of these out while they're in the waiting area. Leave a clipboard for them. They can fill this out. They don't need a lot of instructions. It's a couple sentences. You can collect this, set it aside, score it after the first appointment, and maybe after 6 appointments, it's time to re-administer the BDI and see where they are. This can give you some clues. Is the therapy moving in the right direction? Are they doing their part? Are things getting better, worse? Are they steady and stable? And one of the things you might be looking for is, you'll notice that 1 to 10 says these ups and downs are considered normal. And this is where we get to the notion of, well, what is normal? Should I begin discharge planning when the BDI reads 0? No. There are always lumps and bumps in life. It's not when you live the perfect life, it's time to start talking about termination. What's a viable range of normal functioning? You know, is school attendance, is the goal 0 absences per semester? That's kind of implausible. Maybe the real number turns out to be about 3% absent. So we need to know what's normal about that population, and we get that from running group statistics. What's okay here? And these instruments aren't just made up by a clever psychologist sitting at a desk. These are piloted. There's a whole science involved in developing instruments conceptually, pilot testing them with different groups. That's called norming the instrument, where you find a variety of people and you run the instrument with them and see how it performs. So these aren't just thought up by some clever research scientists and then released to the world. They're strongly tested and developed, and they've got good reliability and functionality to them. So any questions or thoughts on this leap from theoretical raw scores to translated scores? And this is a viable instrument. I've used this before. It really is on target. Questions or thoughts about this? Okay, so if you're interested in these standardized instruments, another name for them, a more generic name for them, is rapid assessment instruments, and sometimes that's initialized as RAIs. Simple. And they really pretty much work exactly like what you saw, where it's just answer a short set of questions and it produces a score. Now, if you're interested in these, there's way more than just depression that somebody could see a social worker about. And these 2 books, the first volume on couples, families, and children, and the second volume on adults, are loaded with an incredible array of available royalty-free, prepared, validated instruments that you can pull and use to measure a variety of phenomenon. And just to give you a little bit of a glimpse of what's contained in these books, here's I just did a sample poll from the table of contents to just give you an idea of the variety of instruments that are available that score just as easily and just as reliably as the Beck Depression inventory. So I'll just give you a minute to just look over these. And again, this is just an excerpt. It's got plenty more, but just take a peek and see what's here. And it sure beats trying to quantify these things yourself. And let me move on to the next. This is the list of metrics for children, and I've used some of these also. Now, some of you may have used a short version of a suicide quantification metric that looks at level of risk, and it's a short list of questions, and that's some serious stuff. It can be administered in a few minutes, and now it takes a lot of the guesswork out of the game. I think my favorite title here is Mood Thermometers. What a great title for these things. And don't be attracted just by a compelling title. Turn to the page, read the instrument, look at the questions being asked, determine if you think they're appropriate, socially suitable questions, if they're age appropriate questions. Don't just grab something because it's got a sexy title, or don't just turn away from something because it's got a tedious title. For instance, the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale. What a boring title, but it's a remarkable instrument. I've used that in a children's clinic, and it was very telling, very useful. We use that as baseline data, and then later on, at the end of the term, we re-administered that. And in the meantime, we've done a lot of self-identity development workshops and some real hands-on work with the kids. And they were no longer nearly as vulnerable to someone sticking their tongue out at them or calling them a bad name. And it was reflected in their scores on the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale. So I would encourage you to, if you ever have the opportunity to leaf through one of these books or acquire these books, this could put you on the top of your game in any facility as you make recommendations. And here is a sample of what you find in adults. And many of us will spend a big part of our career working with adults just because of the larger population. I mean, anyone over 18 is called an adult. And you'll see that some of these just wouldn't be appropriate for children, like an index of job satisfaction or a caregiver strain index or alcohol belief. These just aren't children's issues. So they're very nicely divided among the volumes, and it's fairly easy to go shopping for a suitable instrument based on a variety of disorders and diagnoses. So any thoughts or questions on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I ask my team at work to do the perceived stress scale once a month and report back on it so we can fluctuate sort of when it's changing. And we all have like a monthly calendar reminder to be doing it and to be talking about it.
So is this for the therapists or for the clients?
It's not therapy. We work in a university as sort of student affairs professionals, but we do it, right? It's not for our students who are sort of the equivalent of our clients.
Okay.
It's for the staff,
you know,
be aware of our stress.
Absolutely. And that's valuable to be able to answer some objective questions and honestly, and just say, wow, looks like my stress is peaking a little bit, and that sure beats just arbitrarily crossing the line and burning out. That's intriguing. I like knowing that these are valuable instruments selectively to monitor staff's progress. I would think that something like this would also be valuable for vulnerable practitioners, particularly. I have some colleagues who work in hospice care, and that can creep up on you, and you can lose your sensitivity, and you can lose your sense of feeling. So I'm sure that they have some way of monitoring and not just letting people drift off and lose themselves in what can be a very dark place. There's room for hope in there too, but it's got to be monitored. So thank you. It didn't occur to me that these could be selectively useful for staff. Intriguing. And it's nice knowing that there are ways of gathering uh, these phenomenon. If you have a couple that's doing a bunch of arguing, or if you have an individual who gets into a bunch of arguments wherever they go, what am I going to do? I'll ask them to make a tally mark every time they have a confrontation with someone. Well, I would rather take a look at the argumentativeness scale and see if they've come up with a better way of quantifying this phenomenon that's been gathered and developed in a more scientific scale, or an intimacy scale. I might be looking for the right politically correct words to ask this, and where am I going to come up with that? Well, let's see what others have done, and maybe there's an off-the-shelf answer. Okay, so let's take a look at an entirely different way to go. So we saw that the BDI includes 21 multiple choice questions that takes a little bit of reading to get through to administer that metric. But here's an alternative: is a standardized instrument. We have an alternative. What if instead of that, we reduced it to one question? Maybe they don't want to fill that out, or maybe we found that these clients at this facility just don't have the reading skills or the patience to complete something like this. We have plan B. What if instead of all those questions and pages, we reduced it to some simple scale, like on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being no depression, 5 being high depression, how do you feel right now? Well, that's something that people can answer in a couple seconds, and it's fairly easy to conceptualize. Another way we could go is maybe we'll put it on some kind of a graphical scale. And this can help people to better conceptualize the continuum, because asking someone to think about numbers in their head might not do it. But if they could see that you can glide from this end where there's no depression to medium depression to high depression, maybe they can find themselves on that scale. Because some people are more mathematically minded, some are more visually minded. So this is another way to go. A third way to go, a slightly different variation from that second example, is a classic Likert scale, where you have one declarative sentence. It's usually there's more than one question, but you can do it with one question. I feel depressed, and then what's your level of agreement? And it's scaled from strongly disagree up to strongly agree. And you'll notice these are scaled in progressively higher values, because that's how we think normally, that bigger is better, or bigger is more of something. More money means it's going to produce a higher number. A higher GPA is the higher number, is the more grade points. And so we make no depression the low number, and then we climb up to 5, which is the high number. Now, there's nothing golden about the number 5. It's just easy to compute. I would say it's a good idea, if you're going to build something like this, use a number like 5 or 7 or 9, and that way there'll be a center number where you have neutral or moderate, because they need to be able to find that center point. There's other metrics where it's deliberately 4 choices, and that's how the instrument was developed and standardized. But on something like this, feel free to make up something that gets at the heart of what's going on. Now, this is good, but can you think of a disadvantage that this has over something like the Beck Depression Inventory, those 21 questions?
It's not picking up on like the nuance that the other one could, because this one like is also very subjective because like they could be like, yeah, I'm very depressed, but then if they're asked like more detailed questions and it's like, well, you are, but it's a lot more mild than they thought.
Very good. That's exactly the point, is that here all I have is one number. But if I go back through the pages of the Beck depression inventory, I can look at the ones that they have a 0 on and say, oh, well, they're pretty functional on that. You know, they're socializing or they're sleeping. But, oh, wow, they're up to a 3 on this one. And it gives me some more specifics as to what is the nature of what they're struggling with. And if you were to say open the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, and look over the diagnostic criteria for, say, major depressive disorder or dysthymic disorder or cyclothymic disorder, these are all mood disorders. And it's one thing to say, yes, the patient shows signs, diagnosis is indeed cyclothymic disorder or dysthymic disorder. I would like to know a little bit more on what is the nature of their depression, on what of these diagnostic criteria are they struggling and which are just not happening, because that could help me build a more efficient treatment plan. If what I got here was, let's say, they answered this question at 4, and I'm saying, okay, so they're between moderate and high depression. So this is considerable depression. What would your next question be once they tell you they're a 4? Let's make this a real session. And the first thing you ask them is, well, I'm glad you could come in today. Can you tell me, once again, on the 1 to 5 scale, 1 being no depression, 5 being high depression, where would you say your depression is? And they say 4. What's your next question?
I would ask them to give kind of a little bit more concrete example or reason why it's a 4, because as Judith was saying earlier, is that I stubbed my toes, I'm majorly depressed, and that's the only thing they have to say for it. But there's nothing symptomatic about it for them.
Sure. So maybe we would ask an open-ended question. Well, tell me some of the things that are getting you down this week. What's going into that 4 where you are. And now comes some storytelling, and we're going to move beyond just the numeric, and we're going to get some real details that we can work with, because so much of what we do is based on qualitative research. And so I think we've already talked about the advantages and disadvantages of using the full standardized instrument, which gets at multiple aspects of the phenomena, because depression isn't about just one thing. If you look at the diagnosis for depression, what are some of the symptoms that are included in the DSM for depressive disorder?
Sleep
Or
disturbance.
what observations have you made? Let me just add something else. What observations have you made among people who are experiencing depression?
Sleeping or eating disturbances, whether it's too much sleeping or too little, too much eating or too little.
Wow, you've absolutely hit it right. So we could have eating too much, eating not enough, hypersomnia, insomnia, could be either. Right. So where are they? It could be any number of things. And sleeping is very different phenomenon from eating. What's your energy level? Are you finding it difficult to get things done or to get things started or to even get out of bed? And so those things would be more revealed in a standardized instrument, because it asks about those micro behaviors, whereas here we get one number, and we would professionally track down the backstory behind. Well, tell me what's making you a 4 this week. I mean, there's other ways to ask that, but yeah, I think you've hit the topic right on. So with that, what are some examples of some other derived scores that we run into in the world? In other words, how do we measure people in different circumstances beyond, say, the field of mental health? I mean, we're not the only ones doing this. Can you think of any other place where you get a derived score and it converts into a different score? So let me just kick this off. I'll give you an example. I'm remembering back to the days when I had to sit for my driver's license exam, and they're looking for 70%. And so you score any score between 0 and 69 is a fail, and anything from 70 to 100 is a pass. So they take the raw score and then they make a determination. If you're in this block, you don't get a license. If you're in that block, you do. We take the raw score and make a conversion. Can you think of any others like that?
Social services, when you're applying for financial assistance, income.
Income, and they probably collect some other data like how many people are living off that income, like number of people in the household, and they probably run that through some kind of a calculation that produces one or maybe more numbers, and that if you're within this bracket you don't get, and if you're within this bracket you do get, and maybe if you're within this bracket it will tell you what your benefit is. Maybe it's a different number for different levels of need. So right, that raw score gets translated into a derived score. Absolutely, excellent example. Can you think of any others? Pick up a couple more.
I could joke and say age because it says what generation for those of us who are baby boomers down to whatever the newest generation is.
Yeah, absolutely. So what year were you born, or what block of years were you born? Another way to scale age would be something like 1 to 2 is pediatric or infant, 3 to 18 is youth, or maybe it cuts off at teenage, and then maybe 18 to some level is adult, and then we have middle age would be another age bracket, and then we could have seniors would be something like, I don't know, 65 or 68 and older, geriatric population. And so we could slice and dice that continuum into as many categories as you want. Right, so this stuff is done all the time. So once again, derived scores are the raw scores that the research participants produce, or the groups, and then they could convert it in some kind of a meaningful way so that we can make block comparisons and understanding where are they, what category are they in, and instead of everybody having their own microscore, we can put them into groups like no significant depression, moderate depression, and then all the way up to high risk of suicide. So we have things like percentile ranks and height. What's a normal height for a person at a given age? Weight, are they underweight, normal, heavy, obese, whatever it is, and maybe that's a more advanced formula because a 200-pound 6-footer is a very different real weight than, say, a 200-pound 4-foot person. One would be a normal weight, the other would be considered on the heavy side. So probably use something a little bit more advanced like BMI, body mass index, to calculate that. Foot size, we don't measure down to the millimeter. It's like just get it down to, are they an 8 or an 8.5? And then they'll go get you the right shoe. Work hours. It could be a continuum, but we could classify them as part-time or full-time. Years of education. We might call that a particular degree. Income level, lower, middle, upper class. So you can see that these have lots of different ways where we take a raw score and turn it into a derived score. Now, job performance is usually reduced to something like unacceptable, acceptable, exceptional, something like that. Okay, so this lines us up for some time for breakout rooms, breakout sections with your group. And further focusing, these are recommended activities that you could use your breakout time with your group is to continue working on your variable table and deriving your research question and corresponding hypotheses. So, of course, looking down the road is describe the problem of the study, the two variables that you're working in. So, for instance, what do you want to know? And if your variables are about, say, gender and academics, maybe that's your question. describe how the theory feeds into the basis for analyzing those pairs of variables. And also, your research question might be something along the lines of, does gender have an influence over learner type, if that's your pair of variables? And of course, the hypotheses that corresponds with your research question for each of the pairs, whereas the null hypothesis would be that gender is not associated with learner type, or the alternate hypothesis is gender is associated with the learner type. And of course, this is a good time to hopefully finalize the variable table. And as I said, if your group has completed that table or has questions about that table, and this is just an example of one of those tables we went a thorough step through on populating each of the rows of this table, each of the columns of this table. If you need any help in finalizing this, or if you'd like to run it past me to validate that it's in good shape or get some ideas about finalizing it, I'd be glad to work with your group on that. So this goes into assignment 2. And of course, looking down the road, further assignments is describing the problem of the study, describe how the theory works, the research question, the hypotheses, the variable tables. Whatever you need, and then of course each group will proceed using the variables that you've selected for this project. And after the breakout sessions, I'd be pleased to bring everyone back together for, say, about the last 10 minutes of class, and give each group a little bit of a chance to talk about what kind of findings they've assembled and the progress that they've made. Again, I'll make myself available if you need me to jump in and help out. And I think I've corrected the problem that you should all have screen share privileges. If you're trying to share screen and it's stuck, let me know, and I have another way to fix that. But you know, that's part of the team communication and bringing things together. So any questions before we split into breakout rooms?
I have a question. We were looking at questions regarding the framework, and I know one of the questions is to determine whether you're going to be using a theoretical or conceptual framework for the research design. But I wasn't completely sure. Like, we were trying to think about, like, I was thinking it was going to, for our research, a theoretical framework, but how do we determine that? And how do we determine that?
So the framework is essentially that the data was gathered from a survey implementation, which was administered in an anonymous fashion. So you can use that as the framework for the basis of the study of investigating opinions of students, of current students.
So even if the research articles that you'll be using for the second part of the assignment, like how they gather the type of data is different, then it doesn't really matter.
Well, you want to talk about how the data was gathered briefly from the study. Just talk about, and that would be specified in their methods section. But what it comes down to is you say, and then our data was gathered using a standard online survey, an anonymous survey. Yeah. So you could speak of both.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So you don't have to try to make them align with each other. I mean, they are what they are. Other questions or thoughts before we cut to the breakout rooms? Okay, so let me set things up. I'm going to stop share and we'll set up the breakout rooms. Okay, so I've set up 2 breakout rooms, and you should be able to drop yourself in for group 1. Of course, go to room group 1, go to room 1. Group 2, go to room 2, and let me know when you've if you need any jump in from me.